Thank you very much, Roger, for that introduction, and thank you to Roger and CATO for sponsoring this event. I'm very grateful to have such a great kickoff to the book, which is actually being officially published today. As Roger mentioned, I'm going to start and talk a little bit about the mismatch idea itself and some of what we found in the book. Stuart's going to try to relate this more to Fisher and what will be happening tomorrow. I'm particularly glad to be doing this at CATO because it's stood for a lot of the values that I think are in the book. And I first became aware of CATO back in the early 1980s when I was mostly doing community organizing, but in the evenings was thinking about policy issues and whether I should go back to graduate school and become a policy type person. And a big issue that was circulating at the time was Social Security reform. And started trying to analyze what was happening and came up with this idea that Social Security, as then structured, was providing enormous subsidies. People were receiving much more in benefits than they paid in. And the interesting thing was that the subsidies were largest for the upper middle class. So I thought this was a great revelation and should be part of the policy debate. And I started looking around, and nobody seemed to be talking about this. But then I found a little book published by CATO, which had figured it all out, and was trying, not with very much success, to get those ideas into the policy debate. So CATO has always meant to me sort of a willingness to look at the facts and try to figure out what's actually going on. You have to be sort of interested in how politics is actually going to work, but the first thing you want to do is actually figure out the dynamics and take an empirical approach. And another analogy to our work on affirmative action is that at the time, back in the early 80s, imagine how easy it would have been to fix Social Security's problems and to put it on a sound basis. 30 years later, it's going to be a much harder problem to deal with. And affirmative action, I think, is analogous because today we have perhaps the greatest degree of racial peace and in many senses, the greatest feeling of racial justice in the United States that we've ever had. This is a good time to deal with this issue that has been lingering for a while. We may not. We may make it harder to deal with later on, but I hope we'll make progress this year. As Roger mentioned, I first got interested in the question of mismatch when I was innocently working on administrative issues for the law school where I taught. And I was very interested in the idea of academic support, how admissions worked, how our students did after they graduated. And it didn't take long to sort of look at what was happening to sense that something like mismatch might be important. We were admitting students at UCLA with large preferences who had about a 90% chance of graduating, but only about a 50% chance of passing the bar. Welcome.
Thank you.
So that cumulatively meant that only about 45% of the students with large preferences that we were admitting actually went on to smoothly go through law school and get their law degrees. It wasn't hard to look at other schools in Los Angeles that where our students with preferences would have gotten in without preferences to see that those students seem to have much better outcomes. So I started looking into this and looked for relevant databases that could help test it. And by 2004, 2005, developed the paper that sort of first discussed the mismatch issue in the law school context, and found that this was really quite a large problem, that nationally, the great bulk of minority students, especially African American students, were receiving very large preferences, typically on a scale of a couple hundred, the equivalent of a couple hundred SAT points or 10 LSAT points, 10 to 15 LSAT points. That bar passing traits were generally very poor for this group. Only about a third of blacks starting law school in the early 2000s were graduating and passing the bar in their first attempt. This was affecting the lives of a very substantial, very large majority of people who were supposedly being helped by preferences. What really struck me, though, when the article came out was the institutional response. The collective unwillingness of a great many legal academics to engage this at all. The instinctive reaction of a lot of institutions to further restrict data that was already extremely hard to get and further obscure processes that were not revealed. The fact that there was really no law school in the country where somebody who received a large preference could get accurate information about what their actual prospects were if they went to a particular law school. So I became interested in trying to look at this more broadly, and the Searle Foundation contacted me in 2007, and they were very interested in trying to get good, empirically based, non-ideological research done. And together we commissioned a number of efforts to shake loose data from various institutions and to find disinterested social scientists who wanted to work on these problems. Over time, partly through that effort and partly through lots of other independent efforts, a lot of mismatch research has been done. The vast majority of it peer-reviewed and published in excellent journals. So we now know that science mismatch is a pervasive problem, that although blacks are more likely than similar whites to want to major in sciences and engineering when they go to college, they're much less likely to get what we call STEM degrees, science, engineering, math degrees, if they receive a large preference. A study by Fred Smythe at the University of Virginia found that if you take two blacks or two students of any color, one of whom receives a large preference, one of whom doesn't, the student who receives a preference has about a 40% larger chance of dropping out of science on his path through. Mismatch also affects academically inclined students who receive large preferences, would like to become university professors or go into academics someday, but very predominantly receive low academic grades, cluster at the bottom of the class, and decide that academics is not for them. The biggest mismatch experiment was in California, where voters passed Proposition 209, and we had a large quasi-natural experiment of what happens when racial preferences are banned from an entire university system. The results of Prop 209 are extremely clear for anyone who bothers to look. Within a half dozen years of the implementation of race neutrality, the number of blacks in the University of California system had gone up by about 30%. The number of blacks receiving bachelor degrees had gone up by about 70%. The numbers were even larger for Hispanics. GPAs had gone up, persistence in science had gone up. Virtually every outcome had been a dramatic improvement. The only thing that critics can point to as a problem with Prop 209 was that there were fewer African Americans at Berkeley and UCLA, the most elite campuses, which had used the largest preferences when racial preferences were permitted. But this was not actually a bad outcome. Those students who had been admitted to Berkeley and UCLA were still going to UC schools. They had much higher success rates. And because Berkeley and UCLA had hoarded so many minority students, having the national reputation to do so, the race neutrality after 209 actually increased the level of integration across UC campuses. One of the things that we talk about in the book is so-called cascade effect. Can I borrow that?
Sure.
When elite universities admit students, we have a 4-page graphic in the book to illustrate this. The most elite schools have the first pick at the students they would like to admit through preferences. So those very elite schools admit not only the very top African American and Hispanic candidates, but they also admit students who are in the second, third, and fourth tiers of academic achievement. This means that when the second tier schools want to use preferences, they really have to start fairly far down the ladder. And ironically, that means that the largest preferences are not used by the most elite schools. They're used by schools that are actually in the third or fourth tier of all colleges. This is very important for a couple of reasons. One is that it helps explain sort of the strong knee-jerk defense of preferences that's often led by leaders at the most elite universities. Derek Bach and William Bowen come to mind. Because they look at their universities, and in fact, the effects of preferences are significantly more moderated in those contexts. The worst effects of mismatch are at the second, third, and lower tiers. The second interesting effect of the cascade is that it means that even though only 20-25% of all colleges in America are highly selective institutions, they absorb so much of the talented pool of minority students that even schools, say second-tier state universities that simply have threshold requirements to get in, are still going to have a very large disparity among their students and their qualifications, which is significantly aggravated